Welcome to CHI's Masters of Suspicion. This is the Focus on the American Gothic Week 8, Buried Evidence. A little bit of review. Last week we examined the yellow wallpaper, which illuminated ways that our orientations to power exist in the unthinking ways that we use language, even the basic language of pronouns. Gilman's story highlighted the power of language to shape our reality in ways that our imaginative power, whether invested in the Gothic or in scientific speculations, are destructive. The unspoken hope in Gilman's story is that of dialogue, conversation, and openness. And the moral seems to be that it is only when we trust another to correct our blind spots that we can truly flourish. Separately, our need for certainty deceives us, and we're doomed to failure. This week, we look at Ambrose Bierce's A Vine on the House. Bierce is a reporter during the Civil War who had a proclivity for the haunted. This story explores a haunted ruin that exists primarily by reputation. Nothing evil would otherwise strike the eye. It once again reminds us of the importance of place in our lives, the need to know the stories surrounding nearby locations. Stories steeped in the supernatural often, as both Bierce and Irving indicate, have their roots in more primal human urgings. The question guiding today's lesson is, what is it that haunted locations might reveal? So, here we go. Point 1, appreciating appearances. Bierce starts his story with a description of the location, the outskirts of the town of Norton, Missouri. The house has an evil reputation that places it in the domain of the haunted house, and he argues that the following serve as unfailing signs of the supernatural. Quote, its windows are without glass, its doorways without doors. There are wide breaches in the shingle roof, and for lack of paint, the weatherboarding is dun gray. Today, we would observe these conditions as signs of vacancy or disregard, not the supernatural. In fact, neither the tone of the description nor what is described seem to carry with it anything abnormal. One tiny detail remains. Bierce adds that, quote, these unfailing signs of the supernatural are partly concealed and greatly softened by the abundant foliage of a large vine overrunning the entire structure. This vine, of a species which no botanist has ever been able to name, has an important part in the story of the house. End quote. The second form of appearances concerns the nature of the Harding family. Robert, it was said, had no friends and cared to make none. This hardly places him in the popular camp around the town, and makes more likely that he becomes suspected of something. Readers are thus not surprised to learn of a minor scandal. Quote, he and his sister-in-law were rather tabooed by their neighbors, who seemed to think that they were seen too frequently together. Not entirely their fault, for at these times they evidently did not challenge observation. End quote. They were. The wife, though, is described in different terms. Quote, gentle, sad-eyed, lacking a left foot. That's it. Bierce's arrangement of Mrs. Harding's description in her own paragraph allows readers to understand that, at least in this case, the neighbor's suspicions were probably correct, especially when she never returns from visiting her mother in Iowa. Not the fault of mother or Iowa, as is made clear later. The final discussion of the house's history comes in the next paragraph. After Mr. Harding and his sister-in-law disappear without appointing anyone to tend to the property, Bierce writes, quote, nobody knew whither he went. Nobody at that time cared. Naturally, whatever was movable about the place soon disappeared, and the deserted house became haunted in the manner of its kind. End quote. The need to put haunted in quotation marks at this point reminds the reader that the term haunted houses in the first paragraph was also set off by quotation marks. The term supernatural, of course, was not. No clue is given as to what, although the discussion of the looting of the property once again gives rise to very mundane, real-world apparitions. Houses are haunted by those in need, more than often than they're haunted by the undead. Number 2, the haunting of the house. The first mention of those who haunt the house are the Reverend J. Gruber and an attorney named Hyatt, who used the secluded place to discuss business matters. One might wonder, perhaps idly, what form of business could compel such an obsolete location, but Bierce fails to specify. They haunt the house, using its porch to talk, remarking briefly and humorously to the somber nature of the location, an aside that is quickly forgotten, as befits perhaps men of intelligence of the world such as they are. They continue talking until the trembling of the vine makes suggestion of a storm. The problem, as Gruber literally points out, is that, quote, the foliage of adjacent trees, which showed no movement, even the delicate tips of the boughs silhouetted against the clear sky, were motionless. They hastily passed down the steps to what had been a lawn and looked upward at the vine, whose entire length was now visible. It continued in violent agitation, yet they could discern no disturbing cause. End quote. The minister suggests that they depart, and so they do, opting to ride together. They discuss what happened with some townsfolk and reconvene at the property the next day, at the same time, and witness the same event. Quote, the vine was violently agitated while under the closest scrutiny from root to tip, nor did their combined strength applied to the trunk serve to still it. The house becomes a site for the gathering of others, not spirits, but by those, quote, seeking a sign. Bierce doesn't indicate what the sign was of, and only mentions that, quote, it does not appear that any found it, but that the credibility of the witnesses mentioned made it so that none doubted the reality of the manifestations to which they testified. Put otherwise, the house is haunted by reputations, not the reputations of spirits, but the reputation of legitimacy that makes trustworthy reports out of statements that cannot be substantiated. This spirit of a reputation is the only non-material element that haunts the house. Everything else about the house seems all too human, except the vine. Number 3, the vine. The first possibility of a non-human interaction arrives with the suggestion to dig up the plant. Bierce writes, quote, by either a happy inspiration or some destructive design, it was one day proposed, and nobody appeared to know from whom the suggestion came, to dig up the vine. The possibilities for the origin of the idea are, 1, the spirit of the group, where everyone believes the idea and its initial voicing is unremarkable, 2, a voice in the crowd, or 3, the vine itself, which is not accorded with agency, kind of like the wife, and therefore is ignored. The vine, although material, seems to bear its own significance. Bierce writes, quote, in their ramifications and doublings back upon themselves, they made a compact network, having in size and shape an amazing resemblance to the human figure. Head, trunk, and limbs were there. Even the fingers and toes were distinctly defined, and many professed to see in the distribution and arrangement of the fibers in the globular mass representing the head the grotesque suggestion of a face. The figure was horizontal. The smaller roots had begun to unite at the breast. In point of resemblance to the human form, this image was imperfect. About 10 inches from one of the knees, the cilia forming that leg had abruptly doubled backward and inward upon their course of growth. The figure lacked the left foot. End quote. The wife, who had not gone neglected in the story, is made visible only through the absence of things. The vine bears witness to the absence of a body whose shape, given the lack of a left foot, is represented. This causes an inquiry which, quote, brought only one fact of relevance of insignificance. Mrs. Harding had never visited her relatives in Iowa, nor did they know she was supposed to have done so. End quote. Nobody, including readers, seemed particularly surprised by this fact. The fact that the house was on the outskirts of town and the fact that the Harding family were outcasts, shunned by the community, means that the murder of the wife, which could have been resolved in instant action, is left unpunished. Quote, of Robert Harding and the rest of his family, nothing is known. End quote. He, his sister-in-law, and his 2 young children remain as vanished as the wife, or perhaps less vanished, given the vine. The vine itself is replanted at the behest of the sheriff of the county, quote, who is the lawful custodian of the abandoned estate, ordered the root replaced and its excavation filled with the earth that had been removed. End quote. After it is replanted, the house retains its evil reputation, even though the vine, quote, is as orderly and well-behaved as a vegetable as a nervous person could wish to sit under of a pleasant night, when the katydids grate out their immemorial revelation, and the distant whippoorwill signifies his notion of what ought to be done about it. End quote. And with that, the story ends. Number 4, invisible testimony. Bierce claims at the beginning of the story that the vine partly conceals and softens the explicit manifestations of the supernatural. The partial nature of the concealing allows the vine to still have a revelatory power, even though its force is diminished or softened by its nature as something natural. In this story, the wife does not become resurrected in the spirit or the flesh. She's given a new prosthetic body, a voiceless body that can only draw attention to itself through unforced motion. It is an excluded body that cannot speak for itself, whose disappearance remains unnoticed and unremarked upon. When living, the wife had minimal claim on social attention. Even the narrator, whose witness allows for the generation of this story, chooses to focus on the husband and the wife's sister rather than the person of the wife. She's written out of history as unremarkable in herself. Only her second prosthetic body is allowed voice or interest. The non-body of the wife is not a subject and is also not an object. It has some appearance of agency if the witnesses of reputable sources are to be believed. But its testimony is silenced, just as the testimony of the wife was silenced while she was alive. All it can do is attest to its own enduring existence and silently plead for justice to arrive in the form of paying attention. The narrator's framing of the story takes this silent plea a step further, causing the reader to consider the relation of the natural and the supernatural. But even this consideration leads to a rather weak conclusion: the repetitive babble of an insectoid chorus answered by birdsong. The line between woman and land is effaced, as is any hope of meaning or of justice. But thought further, Bierce's story reflects the great American story, the manifest destiny that pushed European Americans across the continent, displacing the previous inhabitants until they were literally transformed into land and landscape. Bierce begins his story with a geographical marker. The old house, occupied by a family named Harding, is a site of injustice. The house is located in Missouri, which had become a state more than 60 years before Bierce wrote his tale. The name of the state, as is true of many states in the Midwest, took its name from a Sioux tribe. This one had the name meaning wooden canoe people, or river of the big canoes. The crimes against the vanished tribes, like the vanished woman, remain unanswered. The bodies of the native peoples who had occupied the area were, like the wife, able to be killed without being murdered. The name of the people became the name of the land. They were transformed into land, just as the woman was translated into the form of the plant. Both transformations into a second body allowed an uncanny second life, but this second life is softened by its natural covering. If considering Bierce's story, or the absence of Missouri peoples, causes an uncanny feeling about the nature of home or land or what is natural, then the story shows the grave nature of injustice that remains buried. It allows the testimony of the land itself to give voice to the dispossessed. The people who are slaughtered, like the wife, cannot speak. They have neither the right nor the ability to do so. The aggressors, like Mr. Harding, have gotten away unpunished. Others have appropriated the spoils of the place. It is perhaps for this reason that Bierce ends the story with a meaningless babble of voices, both those of the ineffectual counselors who are disturbed by the presence of an injustice that it is too late to rectify, and those of the insects who lodge a feeble protest against it. And here, Bierce's story seems to inhabit the space of the Gothic in its truest sense, bearing witness to an injustice without offering the reader a clear sense of resolution. Conclusions. 1. I began this class by claiming that the Gothic gave voice to situations of systemic injustice that were ignored by dominant theories of ethics or morality. I have attempted to point out the ways that this happens, dwelling on the implications of the Gothic for marginalized groups, women, workers, slaves, Native Americans. I hope that the course has been helpful in seeing how to read for ways that the Gothic attempts to reveal, if only partially and if only in a softened sense, injustice that is done in spite of its being legal. Number 2. The Gothic offers few answers. Its point instead seems to be to lead the reader into the plight of paralyzing helplessness. Rather than taking offense at this point, it may instead be beneficial to dwell here. This point is the one that the marginalized in society occupy, one where the language works against their ability to speak or to protest. Although some progress has been made since the 19th century, there's still a long way to go. Crimes against Native women, for example, go remarkably unpunished, as tribes cannot bring American citizens to court. Violence against black males is often legally excused, if not outright sanctioned. The exploitation of migrant workers or workers in other countries continues unabated. The evidence for these crimes exists, but they remain buried. 3. What the Gothic shows in some ways is how we continue to live in an uncanny world, a world that's filled with violence and the threat of violence, but covered over by distractions that allow us to ignore the mute evidence that can only attest to itself. When we see the homeless holding signs, unable to speak, testifying to a condition that is already often all too apparent, it's not too far from the situation of the vine. We accept the conditions of our world unthinkingly, or thrown into it. Like the citizens of the town, we're placed in a situation where crimes were committed too long ago for us to exact some form of retribution. Nothing, it appears, can be done. Although the invitation of the Gothic is to continue to think, to continue to be aware, to at the very least ensure that future crimes are not committed, and that those whose voices have been deemed to have social worth are able to speak for those who have been silenced. 4. The Gothic remains a strange place of wonder. We started the course by looking at the joy held in Irving's Gothic and the way that we can transform the world around us through our perception of it. Alcohol, Poe shows, can do this too, but with less constructive consequences. The point of the Gothic in some ways is to be open to the strangeness of the world in all of its fullness. It gives us an excuse to wonder about the world around us, both the human and the natural one. 5. At the same time, the Gothic is not an answer to injustice. As Gilman shows, it's an alternative that is interesting, but itself must be tempered by other points of view. As long as we employ the Gothic suspiciously, both suspicious of what the Gothic reveals and suspicious of the dominant discourses that surround us, we'll likely be better off than simply accepting the stories told, even by well-intentioned narrators like Melville's lawyer. Thank you.